2,500 years ago, the Buddha gained enlightenment and found a way that he could express his insights to his followers. And amazingly, that still continues 2,500 years later. But of course, it's been through lots of different cultures in that time. And some parts of Buddhism have been sort of interpreted in a kind of slightly strange ways, in that very human way we have, of taking something that comes out that's very beautiful, perhaps, and then we fix it, we kind of make it into concrete, we make it a law, we make it a rule, something like that. And actually, what we're looking at here is how those teachings from all that time, in a very different culture from ours, how we can bring them home so that we can practice them today, what they mean to us today. And the teaching that I'm looking at today is called Going Forth. So going forth is a very sort of basic Buddhist idea. And it starts with the Buddha to be, 2,500 years ago. And he's a young man, a young prince, a handsome young prince. And one night he leaves his palace, so he lives a life in a palace of great ease, and everything that he needs is there. Very loved, lots of things that are, just a fantastic life. He leaves the palace. Is everything all right with my mic?
No.
No. Keep talking. That's why I got quiet, so you can't test it.
Try this one.
Okay. Oh, well, maybe it's the way I've got it.
Might be the way you've got it as well.
I wonder if that will be better now.
Yeah, that's good.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Is that better? People at the back? Okay, good. It's really nice to see everyone waving. Okay, so let's start the story again. So it's 2,500 years ago. It's a dark night, and a young man, a beautiful, handsome young prince, creeps out of the palace in the middle of the night. He goes from the doorway, looks at his wife and his young son who are sleeping, sort of waves goodbye to them, and just creeps out of the palace without disturbing anybody. And he takes his horse and rides to the edge of his lands and then cuts his hair off. So he's got this beautiful long dark hair, but he cuts that off, takes off his lovely prince's clothes and puts on beggar's clothes. And he goes forth. He leaves behind his life in the palace and goes forth to seek for something better. So that's a big step, isn't it? A big step to leave. You've got everything there in the palace. You're living this fantastic life. Why would you do that? Why would you go forth and leave that all behind? So the story goes that the prince, the Buddha to be, had lived a life of where his father, the king, had given him everything. So he had 3 palaces, one for the rainy season, one for the hot season, one for the cold season. He had entertainment. He was the best at all the sports and things like that. He had a great education. But he was never allowed out of the palace. So he lived a very privileged and very kind of protected life. And when he finally did get to go out of the palace, when he crept away, he went out 3 different times and he saw 3 different sights that really shocked him. So he saw somebody who was ill, he saw somebody who was old, and he saw a dead body. And he was really shocked by the fact that this life that he'd known, full of pleasure, full of joy, actually people get old, they get sick, and we all die. And he wanted to find a different way of living. The 4th time he went out of the palace, he saw something, what is called the 4th sight. And that was a person, a wanderer, a homeless wanderer, who seemed actually to have an air about him, there's something different about him. He was calm in the middle of the busyness of the marketplace. He seemed really happy just in himself. There was something about the way that he was moving about, the air, that just gave the Buddha to be an idea. He thought there is another way of living. There's another way of being in the world that will allow me to escape from the suffering that I can see is what happens to all of us. So that's how the story goes, and the story goes that's why he crept out of the palace that night and went forth. He went forth away from his fantastic life to a life of a beggar. So that's the story, and it is a story. So apparently people who've studied the kind of what might be the truth, as it were, of what happened to the Buddha, it's unlikely that those things actually happened. But it's obviously a very mythic, very powerful story that's been passed down, and it has something to say to us today. When I first heard the story, I was a bit disappointed, actually. I was really disappointed that the Buddha would leave behind his wife and his son. I just thought that's really irresponsible. And it kind of reminded me of, I just thought of kind of people who sort of forget their responsibilities and just go off in search of their kind of personal pleasure. Do you know what I mean? They might go and, I don't know, go and live in a yurt or something like that. Not that there's anything wrong with living in a yurt. But I kind of have a sense of someone living in a yurt sort of, I don't know, doing stuff with auras or something like that. It's a kind of for their own personal sort of satisfaction. And I think it's important to know that the Buddha wasn't really doing that. Firstly, he wasn't leaving his wife and child in any kind of financial or emotional difficulty, really. They were part of an extended family, they were rich, they would be looked after, both emotionally and financially. And secondly, he wasn't doing it because he just couldn't bear it anymore in a way, the kind of responsibilities of being a father. He was doing it with a motivation that was for the benefit of all beings. He thought, I need to understand the cause of suffering. I need to understand what's going on here so that I can then benefit other people, including actually his wife and his son. And in fact, his son later on, he met up with his son later on, and his son became enlightened as well. So I think it's really important to remember the motivation behind the Buddha's going forth. So he left home, he went forth, on a noble quest for something that was beyond just the mundane, everyday life, the suffering that we all experience. And after he was enlightened, he then started to attract followers. He'd go and teach in different places, and people would hear what he said, and they'd say, well, I would really like to go forth too, as well. And so gradually more and more people went forth. They became beggars, basically. They became homeless beggars, wandering about. And to imagine what it must have been like, it must have been pretty strong, actually, because you literally were homeless. You didn't know where you were going to sleep that night, so you'd probably sleep under a tree or something like that. Completely dependent on what householders would give you to eat. So you'd have a begging bowl, go around from house to house, and whatever if they gave you food, great, and if they didn't give you food, well, you wouldn't eat. So you would just wear rags, complete rags. So it was quite a radical way of living. And it was a way that was accepted in that society. So actually, even before the Buddha went forth himself, it was kind of tradition in that society. Often on the edge of towns and cities, there'd be a place where people could, like a park. Sometimes they're called deer parks or squirrel parks, interestingly, a squirrel park, where you might be able to go and stay. Probably you'd know, actually, that householders would support you as well. So although you were homeless, you knew you were living in a society that supported that. And many different kinds of people could do it. From in the Pali Canon, the stories about the Buddha's life, you get a sense of people who are poor, people who are rich, men, women, people of different ages, people from all sorts of backgrounds in life. They would go forth. Not all of the Buddha's followers did go forth into the homeless life. Many householders also practiced and attained liberation. They were freed as well. So you don't have to be homeless. You don't have to go forth in order to make progress. But I think it helps. I think what the Buddha was showing is that actually it's a much faster way to make progress if you go forth. So why might you want to do that? So I don't know if you can read this at the back properly. The first one I've got here is a little quote from the Pali Canon. So somebody who's going forth is described in this quote as one who truly follows Dharma, who truly lives in serenity, does good actions, is harmless, who truly has compassion for all beings. So someone who truly follows the Dharma, who truly lives in serenity, does good actions, is harmless, who truly has compassion for all beings. So that's why people would go forth, because that's what they wanted to be. And the reason why they needed to go forth, or why it's perhaps more effective, more quickly to go forth, is that if you do that, the conditions you live in will be more conducive for you to practice. So conditions really affect us, and I think it's one of the things I've just learnt more and more in my life, actually, my spiritual life, is how much conditions affect me. Because I think part of me, I do have this sense of somehow I'm independent of all conditions, and I can decide independently what I do. And that just so isn't true. I'm so affected by the people I'm with. And I realised it a few years ago in quite a kind of, like a minor way, was I went on a first aid course, which is for people who do stuff outside, like people who do canoeing and go walking in the mountains. It's just a weekend, it was a great course. But everyone else on that course was doing their thing called the mountain leadership. And by the end of the weekend, I was like, oh yeah, I think I really need to do my mountain leadership, actually. And I really need to do it because then I'll get able to take people from the Sangha out on walks and it'll be fantastic. And it was just a kind of rationalisation, because I'd been with people all talking about doing all their mountain leadership stuff. I thought, oh, I need to do that. Then shortly after that, I went away with my mum on a holiday, and we visited a lot of her friends and their children. A lot of them had lovely houses. So I kept visiting all these lovely sort of domestic situations, and I kept thinking, oh, when I get home, I really need to sort my house out, and it's actually not that important to me, actually, but I was like, I need to decorate my house, I need to get some really nice furniture, it's like I need to, earn more money so that I can buy these things. And it wasn't in a way that I wanted that, it was just because I was in a condition where that was what people were interested in. I started to want that too. So those are just kind of minor examples, but basically the conditions we are in will affect us. So if what we want to do is change, and we want to change in a radical way that goes against a lot of things in our society, if we want to open our hearts, become more generous, more kind, more aware, if we can change our conditions, we will do that a lot quicker. And that was the same at the time of the Buddha. It worked for the Buddha and his followers, and it works for us as well. So I suppose we have to want to go forth, whatever that means to us today, which we'll talk about more in a minute. We have to want to do that because we think that it will lead to happiness and away from suffering. We have to think that it will lead to freedom. And we have to know that ourselves. I think each individual person needs to work out their own way that they go forth. But we need to have a motivation to want to do it. So the Buddha had a very strong motivation because he was so affected by seeing the 3 first sights. We might not have that same motivation, but there's something about working out for us why we would want to go forth and what it would mean for us. So, okay, so if we decide we do want to go forth, perhaps even just a little bit, how can we go forth today? Because it's not perhaps so easy these days to become a homeless wanderer. Satyajyoti, actually, who's the founder of this Buddhist movement, he did spend a long time in India wandering around back in the sort of late 1940s and 50s. So he did do it for some time, but even he, in the end, felt that it was time to stay in one place for a while. There aren't forests necessarily for us to go and live in like there was at the time of the Buddha. The followers of the Buddha could go and become forest renunciants, living in the forest, sitting under a tree. Living on the street, being a homeless person these days might not be the most ideal way to conditions for us to practice in. So there's something about for us to go forth today. Although some people do live quite a life where they perhaps for some time might be homeless, they might let go of some possessions in order to do that. It's not a lifestyle that I can kind of go, yes, all of us, let's just give up our homes and go out and just hope that we'll be able to live off other people's generosity. So it's hard for us to do that today. The climate isn't brilliant either for us here. But so what many Buddhist groups have done in different cultures, if they've set up a monastic life. In fact, at the time of the Buddha, that was starting to grow as well. So that means a group of people, maybe monks or nuns, get together, live somewhere together, live a very simple life. Traditionally, monks and nuns would have very few possessions, just a few robes, maybe something to sew their clothes with, just their begging bowl. They wouldn't own anything else, and that would be true today mostly as well. And then they would be dependent on the local lay people to support them. So I think apparently, I haven't been to Thailand, but in Thailand, for instance, that's a really common thing. You'll get a group of monks or nuns, and they're supported by the local people. And in fact, it's grown up actually that to support your local monks and nuns is a really good way to kind of build some kind of merit. So quite often a lot of people are very generous to their local monastic community. However, Satyajyoti noticed that some of the traditional monastic cultures had gone a bit things had got a bit stagnant really, and some things had gone a little bit wrong. So the first thing was that there was a big split between the monastic people and the lay people. So that's people who are maybe married or just not monks or nuns. A big split, where I kind of thought that even people who are lay people can't even meditate, perhaps, don't practice. All they're hoping to do is practice so that in their next life they can become a monk or a nun. And what they do is they give lots of money and food to the monastics to support them. He also noticed that not every monk or nun is necessarily practicing that hard. Quite a lot of them would live quite easy lives, have a lot of status, get a bit lazy, that kind of thing. So just a sense that actually it didn't necessarily work very well. So what he thought when he set up a new movement here in Britain is we need a different way of doing it. So he's got a little kind of axiom, which is commitment is primary, lifestyle is secondary. Because in the monastic societies, sometimes it can be that your lifestyle is the most important thing. So if you're a monk or a nun, you're obviously practicing, and if you're a lay person, well, you're probably not. And of course, that isn't true. Lay people can practice too. So in our Triratna order, although we take our practice as seriously as any monk or nun would, we live a whole range of lifestyles. There are people who are almost forest renunciants, like they might be living, like there's one guy I think up in Scotland who does live pretty much in a forest, lives a very quiet life there. Some people live semi-monastic lives, living in a community perhaps, working perhaps in a right livelihood, something like that. Other people are married, have children, have jobs in the world. So there's a whole range of lifestyles. So the important thing is the commitment, it's not the lifestyle. But I think after a while, Satyajyoti realised that people may be taking that a bit too literally. So he added a bit, which is lifestyle is secondary, but not unimportant. Because as I was just talking about the conditions we live in, that will affect us. The life that we live will be affecting us all the time. So how we live is really important. So so the thing that's here is that in Triratna, the order members were neither monk nor lay. The commitment is the most important thing. So because Satyajyoti realised that it's very hard to be practicing as a Buddhist, just kind of like, the thing is, monks and nuns often wear robes. It's quite obvious when you meet one, you go, oh look, there's a Buddhist monk or nun. And if we're practicing kind of just wearing ordinary clothes, going about ordinary lives, it can be sometimes quite hard to do that. So what Satyajyoti thought is what we need is what he calls the new society. So the new society is a whole framework of ways that we can live a life in the UK or other places in the world where we're actually practicing. And I call that's our external going forth. So there are ways that we can externally go forth. So obviously how we live, who we live with, where we live is going to have a big effect on us. So there's a whole, in Triratna, there's a whole range of communities, men's, women's, mixed communities, people living together, living a simple life together, practicing together as Buddhists, meditating together. So there's a whole kind of a sense of you could live in a community. For many people that's not going to be an option. But certainly how you live and who you live with is something to look at in terms of how it supports your practice. How we work, big part of our lives. Most of us, if we work maybe 25, 40 hours a week or even more. So how we work is really important. So that's why we have a number of what we call right livelihoods. That's people working together as Buddhists in different ways. And there's two great ones in Sheffield, which I'm just going to kind of talk about a little bit. So the first is Still Learning, which is a right livelihood that runs education projects for school children. Children come here, go on tours, and also the people from Still Learning go out and visit schools and teach them about Buddhism and meditation. And it's actually 10 years old.
Woo!
This month, which is pretty amazing, I think. So it was set up by Bodhinaga and Dharma Mai, and these days Gaurava and Jordana, and Aryadasa work for it, and all sorts of other people have been involved along the way as volunteers. So it's fantastic, and I can't remember the statistics off the top of my head, but something like, what was it?
Between 25 and 30,000 children.
So in those 10 years, between 25,000 and 30,000 children have heard something about Buddhism, something about meditation because of the Still Learning project. So that's one Right Livelihood, which is doing well. The second is, of course, the Dana Cafe up in Crooks. If you haven't been yet, I recommend it. It's a vegetarian vegan cafe, and it's a little group of people who are involved with the centre work there. I can't see any of them right now. That's probably because they're so tired after working all day. But Dayavadra, Jenny, Grant, and Machudasa are working there. So there are opportunities, and they always need volunteers, as does Still Learning. So if you're thinking you would like to spend a bit of time with other people, working with other people, there are opportunities to do that. Of course, not all of us can go and work in a Right Livelihood. We perhaps have responsibilities, or perhaps we're actually doing a job that we love, that's vocational, that has a real benefit to the world, in which case that's a really important place for us to practice. Certainly within the order there are doctors, teachers, social workers, psychologists, artists, lots of people working. If you need to work just for money, Sangha actually suggests work less. Okay, so just try and get your life simple enough that you don't have to spend 5 days a week doing something you don't like. Instead, maybe work 3 or 4 and spend the rest of the time meditating, being involved in Sangha things, maybe doing something artistic, something that you actually enjoy. Life's too short to spend all those hours just working, just for the money. Of course, as I'm saying this, I'm really aware that many people have responsibilities that mean that some of these things just aren't possible. I'm going to talk about that a bit later. So, how we spend our time. So an external way that we could think about going forth is looking at the time that we have and how we spend it. Time is precious, isn't it? And it's very easy to spend a lot of time on the kind of modern distractions of Netflix, etc. And there's something about how we spend our time that could be perhaps something that would lead to more happiness rather than more suffering. So things that it's worth doing are going on retreat, like going on the Lockerbrook retreat if you want to come for a weekend retreat and give it a taste. Going on pilgrimage is a great thing. I think a lot of people who went on the pilgrimage really got a sense actually of going forth for the 3 weeks of the pilgrimage, of going into a different way of being as a community. And being part of the Sangha. If we don't spend time with people who have the same values as us, it's going to be difficult for us to practice those values. And I think for people who do have responsibilities of families, how you spend the time you do have is really key. That if you can spend it with other Sangha members, perhaps on the family retreats, the family events, that's a really good way of being with other people in the Sangha and with your family. Okay? Another thing we can do externally is perhaps make a commitment, because that tells us something, that tells our inner self something's going on. So that's why becoming a mitra, which is about committing to being a Buddhist, practicing the 5 precepts, and being happy to practice in this tradition, why that can be such a strong thing for so many people. Because we have a ritual, an external ritual, which is great fun actually, and it's a way that your inner self will know that you've really made a commitment. And of course, becoming an order member is even more of a commitment. That's saying you feel like you're ready for the whole of your to make your practice the centre of your life, however you express that, whether you're in a family or not, whether you're working or not, that your life is about practicing as a Buddhist. So those are some external things you can do. And there's something about not underestimating the power of ritual, of rites of passage, for really helping you to go forth, to make a step, to move towards what you really want to do, rather than being caught up in the kind of everyday life things that maybe aren't in line with your principles and your values. Okay, so internally, we can also become homeless, perhaps. So what does it mean to even, I think, people who are order members can get a bit complacent and perhaps not really be mentally homeless, because we're always trying to settle down. It's such a human thing. You're trying to find a safe place all the time. And so there's something about never thinking, right, I've got it, I've really got it now, because actually then you'll settle down too much. So what we can do is ask ourselves a few questions. So the first question is, where do we look for happiness? Are we thinking that if only I get the right job, the right partner, the right holiday, the right experience, climb the right mountain, whatever it is, I'm actually going to find happiness? Or are we thinking that actually happiness will come from within, as we talk about on the newcomers course? Moving, perhaps going forth as well from what we can get to what we can give. I think this is quite an important one for me. I often find myself in a situation and I'm thinking, oh, what can I get out of this? And then I think, oh, can I, if I remember, I think, can I change it round and can I actually go to what can I give here? I've just had a family weekend with 2 sisters and nieces and nephews and my mum and the whole kind of thing. And at times it's a bit fraught, as these family things can be. And when I could remember, hang on, it's not about me getting something out of these people, but what I can give to this situation, then it's really changed around. So there's something about going forth from what we can get, which is something so kind of, so part of our society, isn't it? It's the way that we're trained is what can you get from this, what can you get from this? And actually moving instead to what can I give here? And I suppose following from that is instead of thinking about it's all about me and mine, thinking about the bigger situation, get a sense of the bigger perspective, something bigger than us. Can we move away from thinking about what's good for me and my family and my friends to what's actually something that's good for all of us? So there's like internal ways of moving away from a kind of grasping way of being to a giving way of being. We can do that internally. I suppose also in terms of becoming homeless internally and mentally, we can just notice where it is that we are looking for something to give us stability. Yeah, and just check out, will it really, in the long run, make me happy? So there's going forth internally. However, it's kind of going forth, I've talked a lot about right livelihoods and communities and all sorts of external ways that we can go forth, and they do really work, I think. But we need to find a middle way for ourselves between this complacency that I'm talking about, of like, actually, I've got it sorted out. So someone called Maitreyi Bandu, who's an order member in London who teaches a lot at the LBC, he talks about order members in particular settling down for this kind of really like lovely, precious middle-class life, which is like you've done a lot of work on your mental state, so you're pretty happy, and you get all kind of caught up in what kind of tea you have and how you grind your coffee, all these kind of preferences. Like maybe you've given up some other preferences, but you can really, I really see it in myself. It's like really getting caught up in all these kind of details. And actually, that's not, we need to be radically going away from that, moving away from those preferences. That's just not getting complacent. And there would be, I'm not sure that's a word, but anyway, irresponsibility, not being responsible. So we may have we may have responsibilities, and we may love our responsibilities, and that might be what we really want to do with our lives, is look after our children, look after our parents, our friends. And it's really important that I'm not saying that anyone should be irresponsible, but what we can do is try and find a middle way between a kind of complacency, which is just like living a very pleasant life if we can, and then being irresponsible, but finding a way that we are going forth all the time, that we are going forth. There's a thing called the Dasadhamma Sutta in the Pali Canon, the Dasadhamma Sutta, which is 10 things for a person who's gone forth to reflect upon. And the first of those is, have I gone forth from worldly values? So that's something for us to think about if we want to be going forth, is have I gone forth from worldly values? Am I actually thinking that if only I could, get a fantastic partner and a fantastic job in a lovely house, I would really be happy? Are we really thinking that, whatever our equivalent of that is? Or have we actually let go of those values? So something to talk about in the groups. Okay, so I thought I'd just say a little bit about my own experience of going forth before we finish. So I think in some ways I've been quite a slow going forth person. Even though these days I've kind of like, you know, in the terms of that I've been talking about, I do live in a community and I work here at the centre in a right livelihood. But for a long time, all through my first years of being a Buddhist and my ordination training until long after I was ordained, I had a job in the world and I had my own house. I was very happy about that. And actually, that was really important for me. So I'm not saying that's true of everybody, but for me it was really important that I didn't give up things really quickly before I was ready for it. Because sometimes this whole thing of going forth can seem like you're being asked to give up what you love, what you enjoy, for what? And it's really important that the Buddha talks about how it's not until we're ready that we can give things up. So for instance, when a child has grown out of certain toys, it's really easy for the child to leave those toys behind. You can take the toys to the charity shop or whatever, the child won't mind because the child's grown up. And it's a bit like as we grow, things won't be so important to us as they were before. So it's very important to me to have a secure income, and it was really important to me to have my own space. I mean, during that time, I did do things like I did cut down the number of hours I worked. I think I started working 4 days and 3 days. And I was doing a lot here at the Buddhist Centre, and there's a lot going on in my life as well, which seemed to be about, I suppose, a going forth from things that had been important to me before. But it wasn't until quite recently that I made that big step of actually living in the community and working here full time. And I can't speak for other people, but I don't regret it at all. I mean, I really don't regret it. It's like my life is so much richer than it was when I was working hard and keeping my house going. It's really interesting that at that time it seemed to me, how could I ever possibly give those things up? And now I can see there's a real kind of, there is a freedom and a richness and something in my life that I really enjoy. Now that's for me. That wouldn't be the same for everybody, but I think that I find that quite interesting. If I was to tell myself 10 years ago that I would say that, I would think, oh, I don't think so. So there's something about, and of course in 10 years' time I might go, oh no, why did I do that? So I can't speak for that. But there's just something about, I do find our modern way, I suppose, of going forth in Triratna, living in the community, working here, is very, very rewarding, challenging, but very rewarding as well. So let's finish by so if we go forth from the mundane world, the mundane values, we go forth from things that are tying us back, holding us back. Well, we need to go somewhere. So the Buddha had a vision, didn't he? He had the vision of the fourth sight of the wanderer, who was a different way of being. So I think it's important that we can display that in the world, that we can in our workplaces, with our families, with our friends, we can be, that there are different ways of being in the world. And when we go forth from somewhere, we need to go somewhere as well. So this is where the phrase going for refuge can come in. It's like we go forth from the mundane world and we go for refuge to the Buddha. So that's to somebody who has become enlightened, who's taught us the path. We go for refuge to the Dharma, so the teachings that will lead us to freedom, lead to us becoming kinder, more open, more aware people, and the Sangha, so the community that we can do that with. That there is, we can go for refuge to that. And next week, Vidania is going to talk about going for refuge and what that means. So we can have a sense of going forth this week, and then next week we can go for refuge.